Lessons Part 2, Black Women's Stress. And in this section, we are going to talk about what may be behind some of the risk factors that may lead to hypertension and type 2 diabetes. We're going to focus on the psychological factors. But first, we're going to look at a little bit of the anatomy of our brains so that you can learn a little bit more about how stress and how things in your mind might affect things in your body. So we're going to start with this interesting figure here. This is a representation of your brain. This is what your brain looks like, and it's a model. And the piece that we're going to pay attention to is this little highlighted piece here called the hypothalamus. It's a very old part of the brain. It's very primitive. Everything automatic happens here, and it causes your heart rate to increase and for your heart and blood vessels to contract or move apart and come back together. And it increases the pumping of blood to help you prepare for things that happen during stress or stressful periods. All right. What is stress? At the end of the day, stress is just when your body and your mind are being called on to do something that you may find challenging to do. Okay, so it's about looking at barriers, it's about addressing things that are not easy and common for you to do. Okay, they represent the out of the ordinary. The other thing about stress is that it forces you to consider what your response is going to be. It's either going to be fight or it's going to be flight. And we also know about new ways to respond to stress called freeze, but we'll talk about all of that a little bit later. But it is important for you to know that the hypothalamus is this part of the brain that begins or starts the stress response. It's automatic and it causes the heart rate to increase and for blood to be pumped more quickly through the system in preparation for fight or flight. Now, this is the pituitary gland, all right? And the gland itself is right here, all right? So the hypothalamus feeds down into the gland, which is right here. There's the back of the gland and there's the front of the gland, okay? So stress causes a response to come from the hypothalamus and down to the gland. Dr. Johnson, why are you showing me all of these anatomical structures? All right, why are they important? It's because the stress response is what makes you or makes your body automatically do what it does, all right, when you have stressful events happening in your life. All right, so hypothalamus goes to pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland talks to the kidneys, and I promise you I'm not going to hang on to this too long, but I definitely want you to know that all the organs of your body are involved in the stress response, all right? The kidneys, these two structures here, are releasing a hormone that causes the blood vessels to squeeze, right? So what do kidneys have to do with blood vessels? Well, during the stress response, the blood vessels are controlled by the kidneys, who are telling the blood vessels to hold on to salt and water. All right. And what did I tell you about salt before? That African Americans have a low tolerance to salt. So salt damages their vessels. Okay. So if you're having a stressful time, then you're making your blood vessels hold on to more salt. All right, which is increasing the amount of pressure in your blood. So you may not have taken physics where you would have learned that salt and water together create volume and pressure, but at the end of the day, salt and water make the blood volume bigger. Okay, so it makes pressure go higher. All right, and what is pressure? You know, pressure is the problem that's behind hypertension or high blood pressure. All right. So this is why we hold on to the salt in the food we eat. And this is how it increases hypertension, because together, along with stress, which is also increasing hypertension and increasing the salt in your bloodstream, together, those things are just making you twice as much at risk. So those are the kidneys. Now, the kidneys, I don't know if you noticed before, but sitting on top of the kidneys are these two glob-like structures, and those are called glands as well. Okay, and the job of glands is usually to secrete or let out or to emit some type of hormone. All right, in this case, the hormone, is cortisol. All right, so the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys and it lets off the main stress hormone. It's called cortisol. And it tells the body that the body is involved in a stress response. Okay, so this hormone causes you to disable functions like thinking ahead of time, planning, organizing, controlling your impulses. So you stay in this chronic stress state, all right, because you pretty much are always foggy in your thinking. All right. So sometimes the stress can just happen in a brief period of time, like if you're in a car and you're almost about to be in an accident, or if you're sitting in a room and all of a sudden a giant bear were to run into the room. Okay, you would suddenly stop and drop everything you're doing to focus on the emergency at that's at hand. Okay, so but sometimes we aren't dealing with a bear or a car accident. Sometimes we are just dealing with the day-to-day stresses of everyday life. All right, and when that happens, it has an effect on you long term, and you stay in this pattern too long, and it will upset your thinking. It will make you make poor choices and have poor behaviors. All right, so the heart has and the heart is impacted by this as well, because we mentioned how, the blood pressure goes up and you are at risk for the stroke and kidney failure and heart attack. All right. And the heart is also related to the kidneys, because 2/3 of all of the blood, I'm sorry, 1/3, not 2/3, 1/3 of all of the blood coming out of the heart is being um, fed to the kidneys or being sent to the kidneys. And that's because the kidneys have an important job of filtering the blood as well. Okay, so the kidneys and the heart, they go together, like I mentioned before. So when a person has heart trouble, they're going to have problems with their kidneys as well. And the kidneys are very much involved in things that are related to hypertension, things that are related to squeezing the blood vessels, things that are related to holding on to salt. Okay, so why is all of that biology important to know? It's important to know because we are thinking about how we can improve the health of a Black woman. Okay, so this piece of the education um, video is really looking at how we as Black women deal with stress and how it comes from society and psychological issues and um, complicated issues that are not just based in our biology. And then after I give you a little bit more of that information and tie it to your physical responses, I want you to really think about what we're doing in this intervention. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the concepts of the intervention. So let's move on to chronic stress. I have this graphic of an African American woman, um, and I want to, by the end of this graphic, be able to show you how there are so many factors happening that are accumulated and compounded on one another that make it very difficult for a Black woman to be healthy when you really think about it. So, if you will, it's going to end up being a messy graphic here, but it does shed light on how messy it actually can be in the mind of a Black woman when you think about all the factors at play. So we're going to start with structural stressors. Then we're going to talk about individual differences. Then we're going to talk about interpersonal differences. Then we're going to discuss cognitive responses, then behavioral responses, and then physical responses. Now, what do all those words mean? I promise you, I will break those down as we go further into the talk, um, as I look at each thing one at a time, starting with structural stressors. Now, structural, the word structure is referring to things that are in the very foundation of our country, things that have to do with concepts that are not easily addressed or easily fixed. So you have things like structure or foundational issues that involve bias. Okay, I'll start with that concept, implicit bias. What is implicit bias? Implicit means that it's not explicit or it's not obvious. Okay, implicit means that it's implied. And bias means that an individual cannot, um, that an individual is showing that they have a preference of one thing over the other. Okay, so bias is about preference, and implicit refers to the idea that the preference that you have for something comes from deep within. That in fact it's not something that is outwardly obvious. Okay, so that's structural in that it's not something that's on the surface. It's not something that is easy to observe or easy to change. It's structural. And it's why is a structural stressor a problem for an African American woman? Well, if the day-to-day African life of an African American woman involves having to deal with other people's bias towards her, bias that they can't really help that they have, that a bias that's so deep and foundational and structural that there's really hard to identify it or to be able to even address it, then that creates a stressor. Okay, so we're gonna, by the end of this talk, be able to list the many stressors that can all accumulate and form a situation where a woman might be considered stressed. All right, so implicit bias, social isolation. All right, so if someone is experiencing bias that by other individuals in society, by people, by systems, by organizations, by institutions, programs, if you're experiencing implicit bias on a regular basis, then it would be possible that after a while you would feel somewhat isolated from your society in general. Because if they're biased towards you or have a bias against you, then you are going to know what it's like to be isolated. Okay? At this point, we are not putting any particular blame on any structure who would be, or any organization that might be doing the isolating. But the idea that a person is experiencing bias on a regular basis would make sense, that they would also experience isolation. Okay. Objective social status. Objective social status refers to your socioeconomic status, like your education, your job, and how much you get paid, your income, your wages, your um, financial aid, things that contribute to uh, your ability to make money in society and your ability to then be able to have status in society because of it. So where you live, what kinds of schools you go to, if you go to public schools, these are all indicators of socioeconomic status or objective social status. Okay. All of these can be structural stressors if there's nothing you can do to change it. one important thing to know about African American women is that in terms of objective social status, they have the opportunity to be in a high social status. However, because of implicit bias, society generally isolates them from things like excellent neighborhoods. And by excellent neighborhoods, I'm implying a neighborhood where one could go to excellent public schools, or where the that the things that are available in society are readily accessible. Things like high quality grocery stores, things like high quality, I mentioned schools already, but other types of products that people would want to have in their own neighborhood. Why is that? Just because of a historical bias against having African Americans live in certain affluent areas, or the fact that African Americans consistently have lower wages than their white counterparts or their Asian counterparts. Other factors like that exist across the board when it comes to Black people. The idea that they still deal with feeling like, or actually being treated like, second class citizens. So that becomes this stress that a person wears just because of their cultural background or because of their status in society.